Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We have Stephen Spencer, author of The Great Goodbye. Stephen, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes, this is about an experience I had in the Vietnam War more than 50 years ago. For over 50 years, I really didn't want to talk about this experience, but uh, eventually, people that I knew, uh, basically that I shared it with, wanted me to share the story. So eventually, I ended up writing the book and talking about it. Now, what the book is about my relationship with a Vietnamese woman that I met in Vietnam. Uh, I fell passionately in love with this woman, and we were engaged to get married. And during the war, we intended to get married while I was there in Vietnam, but there were a lot of roadblocks, the way the military worked. And we were both young. I was 19, she was 17. Both of our sets of parents didn't want us to get married. And we were dealing with that. And also, the Vietnam War was kind of winding down, and they were taking troops out. And ultimately, it came to my orders. I had already spent about 11 and a half months of my tour anyway, but they gave me orders to go home, and I still hadn't resolved the issue of trying to get married to my Vietnamese fiance. So when I was set to go, I gave her a promise. I said, I will come back for you. And I said, I will do this. I will come back for you. And we left, and I'll never forget the look on her face when I was leaving. It's kind of like followed me in the truck when I was going around the corner and everything. And, it really got to me pretty bad. And I got back to the States. I was assigned a stateside position with the military police in Fort Knox, basically opening up the mail, looking for contraband like drugs, weapons, and things like that, explosives. And also, taking soldiers to Fort Levendale, some of the prisoners that we had. What was it? Not Fort Levendale. It's Fort Leavenworth. I'm sorry about that. I'm mixing it up with Florida here. But anyway, aside from that, I was writing to her about twice a week. And then when I wasn't getting a response, I was sending registered letters. And I wasn't getting any response to that. And then I picked up my volume of letters to about 3 times a week. Nothing was coming back. I was getting no response. I called my father back home to see if he had received any letters there. He did not. I got very concerned over several months when I didn't get any response to the letters. So I started a non-based search. So I started checking with embassies, consulates, and a chaplain I knew in Vietnam. I wrote to him, and he went down to the village where she was last at, came back and told me that her village had been attacked by the Viet Cong and that everybody had dispersed out of there. Also, American jobs had been lost, and the town was kind of desolate. So, although there were still people there. I also contacted a U.S. Senator. By the way, that was U.S. Senator Edward Kennedy, Ted Kennedy. That was his office because I lived in Massachusetts at the time. And I think I get the best help from them trying to track her down, but they came up with nothing. And so without anything there, with no hope to look at, I just remembered my vow to her that I would come back and marry her, And so that's exactly what I did. I had saved up all my money. I saved up everything I could. And my father drove me to the airport trying to talk me out of it, But I was bound and determined, and I got on that plane and went back. I started in Saigon when I got there. And then I was befriended by an American Vietnamese couple in the Trang who gave me a place to live temporarily. And while I did this search, and I started, I put an ad in the paper, there, it's called the Bưu Tep. And I looked at that, I put that ad out, and just a lot of things there. The ad went out. I got a response for the ad from a woman claiming to be her. And she was in Metah, which is in the Mekong Delta. So I went down through the Mekong Delta. I had to use a boat on my way down. And also I got ferried out by a taxi out towards the Cambodian border, which was in the wrong place. The guy apparently took me for my money. I was naive then. I, paid him, whatever. It was very dangerous in that area. And basically, I was worried about a sniper on the border. So I took a boat out of there, and I got a guy that would take me for so much money. And he put me under a tarp, and the tarp was filled with fish that he had caught. So it was, it kind of pungent in there, I was hiding. We were stopped by the Viet Cong in the Mekong Delta briefly. I was under tarp. They didn't see me. I could see him through a slit, in the tarp there. We continued on. I got to Mita, finally got to her address. And when she opened the door and brought me to the living room, she asked, when we were going to get married. And I looked right at her. And I said, "You're not the one." She wasn't even the right woman. I said, "This is a mistake." And I think she was under the impression that I was her long lost American boyfriend or something like that. She seemed a little bit delusional there. And I said, "I'm very sorry, but I'm not the one you're looking for." And I left the house. I could hear her kind of crying from the inside and everything like that, like she had been expecting her real boyfriend. And but I don't know why that would confuse her. I'm pretty sure our names were different, but I don't know why she did this. So I ended up going back to Nha Trang, and then my next stop was to go to Bangoi, which was the village where she was last seen. And that was the one that was attacked by the Viet Cong. Everybody moved out. I said, "There's got to be some leads there." So I went there, and a Vietnamese woman befriended me there and helped me translate some of the stuff. I spoke some Vietnamese, not much, and but this interpreter helped. We finally found somebody that knew her, and it was an older woman, and she said she had moved to Tuy Hoa. And so I got the address in Tuy Hoa she had moved to. So this excited me quite a bit. So I ended up going to Tuy Hoa using ox carts and whatever was available to me at the time. And I got to Tuy Hoa, to the outskirts, went in. It was at night. Knocked on a door, and I met a friend of hers, and her name was Miss Chang. In the book, it's Trang, but it's really pronounced Chang. And she said, yes, she had been expecting you for so long, but after a year, she pretty much gave up. And I said, "Where's she now?" And she said, "Well, she lives in Ban Ma Thuy with her parents." And so I'm going to make a long story short. I ended up going to Ban Ma Thuy and was kind of stopped by the Viet Cong, taken off the bus, because there was a Viet Cong stop there. They usually stopped buses, took tolls from them. That's one of the ways the enemy worked. I pretended to be French, and I got away with it. And it was pretty bad. And got back on the bus, went to Ban Ma Thuy. Her mother said that she had married somebody when I got to that address, and for me to go home, which was not true, And I went out and searched the fields, and I found her in a field. Ultimately found her, after all that time. It was about a year, almost 2 years, and everything like that. And I ran down to see her, and she said, "Well, I hadn't heard from you. I didn't get any letters from you." And I said, "Well, I did write you." And I took a whole big stack of letters that I brought with me, and I showed them right to her. And I said, "Here are the letters, right there." I said, "All of them." She goes, "Oh," she said, "My parents must have done this," because she recognized some of the receipts and everything. And her parents were returning the letters. And and she said, "Well, it's too late now. I'm already engaged to be married." And it turned out that her parents had arranged the marriage, I think in a way to get her over me or something like that. And I tried to resist that. And I found out further that her father had befriended the Viet Cong over all this time. And we got into quite the scuffle. I ended up with a fight between her father and myself. He tried to have me killed, and it just went on. There's more in the book. It just was a big confrontation between me and the enemy right there. And finally, I was able to see her again because they had taken her away, and I found her later after another search there. But it looked like she was about ready to have a nervous breakdown. And I did not want that to happen. I mean, I was trying to get her to come back with me. I said, "You might as well just give all this up. This is bad here, And she couldn't leave her family. She was stuck. And also, these arrangements, when they arrange marriages, they give dowries, and there's a big penalty if they don't go through with it. And, I don't know what they do to each other. There's different Vietnamese clans and things like that. So I saw the spot she was in, and I thought, I think my presence here is worse than it should have been. And I didn't expect all this when I got there. I said, I think it's best that I leave. And I didn't want to say that to her, but she agreed. And she was, but it looked like she was, she was in tears and everything like that. But I said, I don't think I think it's the best thing now, just the look on her face was horrible, and I didn't want her to, I don't know, like the nervous breakdown thing I was trying to cover. So I ended up leaving her and going back home. After that, the chase against me in Ban Ma Thuy had stopped. There were men after me there over this. And I got back on a South Vietnamese convoy. And I got through the checkpoints again. This time the Viet Cong didn't come out because it was a convoy, and they didn't stop it. And I got to Nha Trang. I got settled there. I was out of money. I'd lost about 20 pounds. I was all scraped up. I was messed up. And finally got back and ended up at Ohio State University, where I got counseling, and it's covered in the book, my post-traumatic state I was in. And, it goes further into that, but eventually the book ends with my meeting my wife several years later. And it forms a closure. And I had told my wife about this, and she always thought I should do something about it. But anyway, that's basically the gist of the book.
Wow, what an incredible story, and just like such a romantic tale. That's incredible. And I'm so glad that you took the time to write it all down. What inspired you to eventually write the book?
Well, for years I didn't want to. I mean, we're talking over 50 years. And I thought it was a bad chapter of my life, and I didn't want to relive it. And my wife, when I finally met my wife, she said, you should do something with this. You should write that up. And for 22 years of being married, I still didn't write it up, even though my wife was pushing me to do it. Finally, after 22 years, I just gave up. And I said, okay, honey, I'll write it up. But I ended up calling a podcast producer before writing the book. And he was a guy named Adam Prince. He was out of Voyage Media. And when I told him the story, he says, do you have any evidence of that? And I said, well, yeah, in the garage, I got a box of stuff, with all that information in there, the pictures, the letters, the plane tickets, the orders and everything. He goes, can you send me some of that? Can you scan that and send it to me? Because I guess he wanted to know if I was really telling him the truth. So I did that. And finally, I sent it to him. He calls me back and he goes, holy crow, so to speak. And I said, I can't believe this happened. He goes, yeah, it did, and that's who she is. And there's a picture of us together and, and everything. I was showing him all that. And, a letter that I left that American Vietnamese couple, if I don't get back, please give this to this, it's pretty much, I didn't know if I'd make it out alive, but that's all in the past. I did. And, finally, Adam said, I want to make a podcast of this. And he did. So Voyage Media made a podcast, and they named it The War Bride. And it's out there now. It's on Spotify and all the major podcast places. And then he said, did you ever write a book about this? And I said, no, my wife's telling me to write a book, And I said, he said, you should do that. So finally, that was pretty much two people getting on my case to try to write the book. So I did. So I finally got to my computer and just wrote it out, and it just kind of flowed out, And I got a publisher, and they published it. And then later, I got another call, and it was a call from Hollywood producer, and Adam was there, and he said, we'd like to make a movie of this. And so right now they're trying to look into making a movie of The Great Goodbye. They'll name it after the book, not after the podcast, but, and, they we're going to pay me a sum for that. And but I'm heavily involved in that project right now. And so they have a director now, an actor, a lead actor, and everything like that. I won't spill the beans on all that because the film's not made yet. So even though they're in development, they don't really announce it till it happens. But apparently it's in the works. So anyway, that's what inspired me to write the book. My wife and the podcast producer, mainly my wife.
Well,
so
Stephen, that is so cool. And I'm so glad that she kept pushing you to write it and that you eventually did. I mean, it sounds like an amazing story. Is there anything else that you want to share about yourself or the book or the message of the book?
Well, I guess I had a lot of closure from the book. I have to admit, I don't think I really had full closure, even during the marriage, because, even though I talked about it, my wife saw that resistance to me trying not to relive it. And she basically told me, she said, you don't have closure on that then. If you can't talk about it, there's something bothering you still, she said, you really ought to just release it and just let people know about it and it'll be good for you, And I think she was right. And, since then I've been able to talk about it and I've shared it with the world now because it's all over the place. And so, and it's kind of funny. I met her when I was a college professor, and I was just sitting in a park and I was doing a lesson plan in the park. And she happened to be sitting on a bench and I just looked at her and I did a double take. And all of a sudden, my Vietnamese girlfriend was named Lien, Lien. That's how you spell it in Vietnamese. And I suddenly thought about her. And then all of a sudden in my head, I thought, Lien who? And I looked at this other woman, I said, it has been a long time, hasn't it? And I just walked over to her and introduced myself and we got along great. And the next thing you know, we had several dates and I asked her to marry me and she did, and we got married. So, and that's how that all ended up. And it's how the book ends too, my sharing it and having closure.
What a great story. And yeah, I bet it was so therapeutic for you to write all of that down into a story and to share it with everybody. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody go get a copy of this amazing book, The Great Goodbye by Stephen Spencer. And thank you again, Stephen.